Hi everyone, Fire Inspector Stu Corbett again with another installment of safety tips. This week I'd like to talk about propane safety around the home. And this was prompted from a message I received from down east about someone who apparently was injured by picking up the can and shaking the cylinder and it exploded. And they were checking to see how much was left in the cylinder. Now, I haven't actually heard of that happening before, and I don't know the circumstances of this situation, whether the cylinder was faulty or the valve was cracked open and a spark ignited it. I don't know. So I thought I'd check into that and dispel whether it was an urban myth or whether this is in fact a safety concern. And the people at the outlet that I talked to suggested that shaking the can is not an advisable way to check to see whether there's enough fuel in there. But they also said that it sounded like a very unusual situation that just shaking the can might cause it to explode. So I would recommend against it. There are other ways you can check to see how much fuel is left. Just simply lifting up your cylinder and checking the weight, and if it's fairly light, it's probably pretty close to being empty. You can also get little devices that glue onto the side of your can, and that will show you an indication of where the fuel is. And one little tip that I learned was you can take a glass of water, pour it down the side of the can, and where the fuel level is, it will stay wet below that, but it will dry off above that. And that's because the propane under pressure is a little bit colder. And that makes perfect sense. I've often seen that if you're using a propane cylinder quite heavily, you'll actually see the can start to frost up a little bit. Okay, so those are the alternatives to checking for your fuel level. You don't need to check it. But when you're refueling, that's when it can be dangerous if your tank is allowed to get too low because you have too much air that's inside the cylinder, and that can be dangerous for the attendant refilling your can. So if you know your can is completely empty, please tell the propane attendant that it needs to be purged. And what they'll do is they'll get all of the excess oxygen air out of that tank, and then they will refill it to the proper levels. You also want to make sure that your expiry date, which is found on the collar of the cylinder, is no older than 10 years old, and the attendant should be doing that anyway. And he is not permitted to refuel that cylinder if it has exceeded that expiry date. So, some other tips I'd like to talk about with propane just around the home. And these may be common sense, but sometimes we forget. When you're lighting your barbecue, the lid should always be open. You have an explosive contained situation. If you try and light it, whether it's using an external source or with the piezo lighter on your barbecue. So always, lid is open when you light it. If your barbecue goes out for any reason and the gas has still been on, it's recommended that you open the lid, turn off all the valves of course, open the lid, and let it sit for a full 5 minutes before you try to relight it. That should allow any excess propane that's been gathered in there and sitting inside the barbecue to evaporate, and then you'll be in a safer situation to light. Checking all your connections on your cylinder to make sure they're tight is very important, and you can even use a little solution of water and soap, dishwasher soap, on a cloth and just kind of wipe it around, and if you see any bubbles you might have a leak, and it either needs to be serviced or you can just tighten it up. Your barbecue should be clean. I have attended barbecue fires where drippings that have collected over maybe months or whatever have dropped down onto the contents below, including the cylinder and the hoses, and it has actually melted and burned through hoses, and that's when you have a serious propane fire and a dangerous situation for your home. One of the biggest safety tips, and it's actually a code requirement, is you are not permitted to store your cylinders indoors, whether that's inside the house, and it should not be inside a garage either. These should be stored, if they're not hooked up to your barbecue, outside the home. And that is a code item. One more thing. I often get the question of whether barbecues are permitted on balconies or not. Yes, they are. Propane barbecues are permitted on balconies, but not solid fuel barbecues like your small briquette barbecues or your hibachis. Even if it's a full standing feature, you're not allowed to have solid fuel appliances on your barbecue, but you are allowed to have propane powered appliances, and they can be attached to the cylinder at all times. Okay, if you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to call me, or if you have any ideas that you'd like me to talk about, I can be reached at the Fire Hall in High River, or my direct number is 403 336-5903, or you can always get me at scorbett@highriver.ca by email. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.